Hey gamers, Chris here. Recently my attention was drawn to a tweet that said, and I quote, "When playing, I always end up playing more of a DPS character, sticking to Sorcerer or Warlock. What do you guys play as?" And the options were Tank, DPS, Healer, and the Almighty DM. So when I saw this, I decided it was time to make a video about the roles within a party.
Odin's son!
You had one job.
This is something I've written about since my first Wizard Guide. I listed a list of what I felt the roles were within a party, and I've done so for every Wizard Guide I've done since then. And my feelings on it have evolved even somewhat since the last one I did, which was maybe about 4 years ago. So let's talk about what the roles are in a party, what I think is effective in terms of Dungeons & Dragons. So, welcome to Treantmonk's Temple. So I think the first thing we need to talk about is video games. Because as we can see from that tweet, what's happened is that people who play video games and then are maybe playing Dungeons & Dragons and maybe for the first time or they're new to it, come to Dungeons & Dragons thinking that what they're going to be doing is playing a video game style game on tabletop. And the thing about video games is if we look at games like World of Warcraft, we can trace these back to Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons inspired a lot of the early video games like the Ultima series and such. That led to things like Ultima Online, that led to things like EverQuest, that led to things like World of Warcraft. And so when we look at the roles and the classes within those kind of games, we often see similarities between them and Dungeons & Dragons. But what's happened is as time goes on, those roles have become more complicated in tabletop role-playing as rules books become expanded and there's more and more player options. And in video games, we have seen actually those roles simplify. And the reason we see them simplify is because, number one, you're playing real time, so you don't have a lot of time to choose. And number two, you need to have simple actions available for those characters so that they can quickly do the things they're supposed to do. And that's not the case when we're tabletop role-playing. When we're tabletop role-playing, not only do we have a large list of spells or abilities to choose from, but in addition, there's thousands of options within the rules of other things we can do. And beyond that, then there's theoretically an infinite number of things that we could do that maybe aren't covered by the rules, and that's why we have a DM. So because of that creativity, we find that tabletop role-playing ends up being a much more complex experience than playing video games. It's one of the main reasons why I like role-playing more than playing video games, is because I find that there's just so much more involved in it. And the characters are so much more complex, and there's so many more options. So let's talk a little bit about what happens outside of combat. Because with D&D, we tend to have, there's really three kinds of challenges. There's your puzzle challenges, and your puzzle challenges are usually actually not a challenge for your characters at all. They're a challenge for the player. So you get those little tidbits of prophecy or clues, and then maybe you have to figure out a puzzle to avoid the traps or to find the treasure. And usually the players do this outside of game and then apply it to their characters. Then you have out of combat challenges, and those are basically every single uncertain event that happens outside of combat. And it is important that these are uncertain events. If this is all certain stuff, then we don't have to build our characters towards achieving it. But there are certain things that happen in game that aren't certain, and that's what we need to make our characters able to do so that we succeed in those challenges. And then, of course, then there's combat challenges. And every combat, of course, is a challenge. And we make our characters so that they can work together appropriately to defeat those challenges without character death. Now, there is some talk about whether D&D is a storytelling game, or maybe it's more of a role-playing game, or maybe it's more of a tactical game. And usually the debate goes something like this. Somebody will say that, D&D is all about storytelling, and it's all about the DM telling their story, and then the players are invited on this journey that the DM takes them on to tell them this story. Now, I don't care how good a writer the DM is. That's not a good way to play D&D, because I can watch TV, I can read a book, and I can get good stories. I want a story that I'm going to be involved in, a story I can change or influence in some way. So I find the best stories are actually those that don't overwhelm the game, and instead are something that is just part of the game that kind of evolves. Usually it's organic, and usually it's mixed in with other kinds of challenges and role playing. The second thing is the role-playing game. The idea that the best thing about D&D is having a bunch of engaged players interacting with each other. And I like that part of the game a lot. It's one of my favorite parts of the game. But I have played in campaigns where you have a DM who really doesn't have a story. And they come in and it's like, so what do you do? And I'm actually reminded of a particular campaign I was in. My favorite character of all time was actually a Vampire the Masquerade character. This is good 15, 20 years ago. And this character was a toreador and a highwayman, and a very interesting character, had great dynamic with the other players and the other characters. But the DM would come in, and this DM is now actually one of my favorite DMs. But at the time, there was a lot of sitting down. He obviously hadn't planned anything, and then he would just kind of go, so what do you do? And then we would be forced to come up with ways to interact with each other, just to do something. And although there are happy memories of that, I definitely remember most of the time it was boredom. Because we're just trying to come up with something. Role-playing on itself just isn't enough. And then the third part is the tactical part, and we're really talking about the challenges. And the challenges can be combat-related challenges or non-combat-related challenges, and how we approach them. How we build our characters, how we move on the battlefield, what of our character options we use, and how we work together. And again, this can be a very interesting part of the game, but on its own, it also becomes boring. I mean, it is really the part that tends to mimic a board game most. And I like board games, but I don't like board games as much as role-playing. The best campaigns mix all three. They have a DM that starts with an organic story that's interesting and draws you in, and then there's a lot of role-playing with enthusiastic players who are developing that story as they go, and then there's challenges that include risk, and that risk has to include the risk of death. It has to include the risk of failure, and so therefore there's something at stake. And that brings excitement to the game. And those three things combined together make for a great game. Now, for challenges to be risky, then as players, we need to look at it as a challenge right from the character concept point. And that's when we start talking about character concepts. That's when we start to talk about what roles we're going to play in the party. And in the old days, we used to talk about, okay, so you're playing a thief, okay, so I'll play a fighter, and you'll play a cleric, and you'll play a wizard, okay, we're covered. But now, things are so flexible. Just because you're a cleric, are you going to be a melee cleric? Are you going to be a ranged cleric? Are you going to be a light cleric that can cast fireballs? Who knows, right? We need to find out exactly what your characters can do, rather than what class they are. So let's talk about out-of-combat challenges a bit. And out-of-combat challenges, I find, usually are less dire than the in-combat challenges. In fact, a lot of them are not intended to be roadblocks. They're just intended to be story elements along the way. So as long as you have somebody who can deal with these things in any way, usually you're okay. The first of those would be what I refer to as the face, or sometimes they're the leader. And it's usually somebody who's going to have a good charisma, and then they're going to want some proficiencies in social related skills. The most common used is persuasion, and then deception, intimidation, insight. These are kind of secondary. The second role I would consider is the scout. And the scout tends to be somebody who is sneaky. They need to have the stealth skill. They probably need to have a pretty good dexterity. They likely are not wearing armor that's going to give them disadvantage on stealth rolls. But in addition to stealth, they need to have decent perception so that they can spot enemies. Also, that so they can spot traps. Now, depending on the DM and on the adventure, sometimes spotting traps isn't a perception roll. I've seen it be an investigation roll. I've even seen it be a survival roll. So you might want to have a conversation with your DM about how they handle traps. And then this character should also be able to bypass traps or figure out how to disable them. They probably need Thieves' Tool proficiency as well. Now, there's other ways to deal with locked doors besides Thieves' Tools, but Thieves' Tools are also often used to disable traps. Finally, the scout often is the one who is also tracking, so they will often need the survival skill so that they can track enemies. Now, just some tactical advice: if you are using a scout, do not send them too far ahead. A scout should always be within range of the party. You just want them far enough ahead so that maybe they're the first ones who can see enemies with dark vision before the rest of the party comes into view, or maybe they're far enough ahead so that the rest of the party doesn't have to make stealth rolls. But if they go further ahead than the party can reach, then what you're doing is you're creating a bad situation tactically and for role-playing. First for role-playing because everyone else gets pulled completely out of the action, and suddenly you've separated the party and it's a one-man show. They hog all the limelight. Everyone else just sits there and does nothing. I've seen this happen with druids who will wild shape into like a rat or something, and then they'll investigate an entire enemy complex. Well, the rest of the party just sits there. It's terrible. I've been the DM in that situation, and I had to take that player aside and explain that that isn't a good way for us to move forward as a group, just for fun, never mind the tactical reasons. The second, of course, is danger, because if that scout gets discovered, all they need is one failure, and suddenly they're by themselves. And if they're by themselves, they might go down immediately. If they go down immediately, what are the enemies going to do? They're going to twiddle their thumbs, or are they going to finish them off? They'll probably finish them off and then come looking for you guys. So then you're going to be dealing with character deaths. And once you start dealing with character deaths, especially when it's a case where they had no chance at all, then you end up with players who are upset because their character died. Maybe their initiative hadn't even come up yet and they're dead. So tactically, just what you want to do is make sure that scout's in view of the rest of the group and not too far ahead so that the rest of the group can get involved if something happens. It keeps everyone engaged, keeps everyone in a position of risk, and that keeps everyone excited as well. The next out of combat role is the muscle or the tough guy or the strong man. This is somebody who lifts the gate that's stuck or pulls the lever that's stuck or bashes down the door that you couldn't bypass the lock from. Or maybe they're using athletics to move a person that shouldn't be in their way, maybe pushing a guard out of a way or something like that. These things don't always happen in a combat situation. They can also happen in a non-combat situation as well. This is one that often slips through the cracks, and I have found on multiple occasions in campaigns where a physical challenge for muscle comes up, only to discover that nobody has made a character with a high strength. Because, of course, there's good ways to make tanks, good ways to make strikers, good ways to make all kinds of characters without using strength at all. Now you can use dexterity for a lot of damage and for a lot of defense. So it is easy to make a character that doesn't use strength, that can fill pretty much any combat role in the party. But then what happens is then you don't have anyone who can take care of these non-combat role needs for strength. So it's something to think about when you're making characters. Does anybody have a decent strength? And even if you're not a strength specialist, somebody with a decent strength, if they take the athletic skill, particularly if they can get expertise in it by some means, and things like guidance or enhanced ability, you should be able to get by. But it is very easy to make a campaign where nobody has a good strength. And just be careful, because then challenges may come up that are difficult for you guys to bypass. The next out of combat role is the utility caster, and this is the ritual caster in 5th edition, being able to do things like detect magic, maybe the identify spell, comprehend languages. These kinds of things can bypass challenges that come up, and you want to have somebody in your party who can do that. Like I say, this is usually going to be a caster, though you can also get the ritual caster feat as a way to deal with these kinds of challenges as well. And finally, the last role is the knowledge guy. And this is the guy who is going to, when you come up against the dragon, is going to be able to tell you that the green dragon uses poison and that maybe you guys want to have some kind of poison protection before you go into combat. Or knowing what the enemy's resistances are so that maybe you can come up with attacks to avoid those resistances. Or maybe it's just a matter of research and finding where an enemy stronghold is or where a fabled tomb is. This kind of person is usually going to have intelligence and is going to have skills like history, investigation, perhaps religion, perhaps nature, these kinds of skills. Now, when it comes to those roles, that doesn't mean that you have to fit one of those roles. It's very easy, of course, for, say, a wizard to be both the knowledge guy and the utility caster. It's very easy for somebody to be both the face and the scout. So it really just is a matter of making sure that somebody can fill all those roles. So let's talk a little bit about the roles within combat and the ones that I find are effective. The very first one I want to talk about I have traditionally called the big stupid fighter, but they are more commonly referred to as tanks. And tanks is probably a better term because, of course, they're not always fighters and they're not always stupid. At least their intelligence might not be bad, but stupid?
Hit me. I'm serious. I can't feel anything. Hit me. I can't do it harder.
I mean, this is somebody who wants to get hit. Now, what does a tank need to be able to do? Well, a tank has to be able to get into melee because they need to be somebody who can draw enemy attacks. That's their job, is to draw the enemy attacks. And you're going to draw a lot more attacks if you're in melee. And the second thing is you need to be able to shrug off those attacks. Now, this could be by a variety of different means. Maybe you have a ton of hit points and resistance, like, say, a barbarian would have. Or maybe you have a great armor class. Maybe you have the shield spell that can add on to that armor class when you need to. And the absorb element spell to pick up resistance to other kinds of damage. There's lots of different ways that you can make an effective tank character, but one way or the other, you need to be able to take the attacks, you need to be able to absorb the attacks without going down. Ideally, a party will have at least one tank, and they very easily can have two. Now, normally a tank is also capable at doing damage because, of course, taking attacks is reactive. You still have something you need to be doing on your turn, and if you're doing the dodge action all the time, you're going to be pretty bored. So usually a tank is going to be a character that can also deliver damage. It may not always be the most damage in the party, but it should be enough to be at least relevant to the combat. The second combat role is one I've traditionally called the glass cannon. They're also sometimes called strikers. This is somebody who can just deliver a lot of damage consistently and reliably. Archers fill this role amazingly. Rogues are often filling this role. Sorcerers are filling this role quite often, especially if they're mixed with warlock. Or straight warlocks can fill this role reasonably well as well. The idea of this character is they're all about the damage. They may have decent defense, but they're not really made for the purpose of absorbing attacks like a tank is. In fact, in many cases, they might not be very good at that at all. Now, there's two kinds of strikers. One is the single target striker. So this is like your warlock who can do an eldritch blast that does a whole lot of damage to a single target. And then there's your area of effect strikers. So these are your fireball guys who can do a whole bunch of damage over an area of effect. And now you can mix these two together, but they're not always mixed together. Quite often, like for example with an archer, you tend to be all about doing the single damage. This tends to be the more common one, where you're doing single damage to a single target. And then it's a little less common to be the one who does the area of effect damage. But you know what? I do think it is important to have at least somebody in your party who can do area of effect damage. Now, those who are familiar with my Wizard's Guides will know that I don't think that area of effect damage is a good thing to build a character completely around, or at least a wizard, or necessarily the most effective thing to build them around. However, I do think you need somebody in your party who can deliver that area of effect damage, because sometimes you need it. When you've got that horde of kobolds going at you and you just can't be killing them one at a time, you need that person who can cast the fireball and just clean the slate. So that doesn't mean you need somebody dedicated to that, but I do think you need to think about somebody who can at least do that when it's needed. Otherwise, I think that it's good to have at least one striker in your party. If you have multiple tanks, you might be able to get by without a striker as long as those tanks are reasonably effective at doing damage. But I do find, especially with ranged attacks, it's useful to have at least one person in your party who can do a lot of damage to a ranged target. That's a good way to deal with things like that wizard who's casting spells, and then you can disrupt concentration, those kinds of things. It creates a little more flexibility than maybe a melee character. The next combat role I'm going to talk about is support. Now, I have traditionally called this the God Wizard. This tends to be the build I'm most comfortable with, and I tend to enjoy the most. Though I don't think this is limited to just God Wizards, which is why I'm going to call it support. And I don't think we're limited to just wizards here. Other classes can perform this reasonably well as well. And support involves 4 different things. Number 1, buffing allies. So that is making your allies stronger. Number 2, debuffing enemies. And that means making your enemies weaker. Number 3 is battlefield control. So that is altering the battlefield terrain or the positioning on the battlefield that gives your side a tactical advantage. And 4 is healing, in combat healing. So things like the healing word or the heal spell. Now, because I normally talk about wizards, I normally don't talk about the healing part. But I do talk about how I don't think healing is a good sole purpose of a character. Because healing, again, is reactive. You're going to play somebody who is really great at healing and not good at anything else. Well, what's going to happen on the first round of combat when nobody is hurt and you win initiative? Are you doing anything? And then after that, can your healing really keep up with the damage that can be caused? Is it really the most effective thing for you to do when party members are maybe moderately damaged? No, there are certain times when healing is appropriate. Somebody went down, they need healing. Somebody's near going down and you have a lot of healing to provide, then that's a good point for healing. But in terms of round by round healing, it's just not effective. So the general guideline I would say is, of these 4 things, you should be able to do 3 of them if support is going to be your primary focus. Now, that all said, these are all flexible. With 5th edition, we have reasonably flexible character options. That means that these roles are not concrete. We can mix these up a little bit. You can be a little bit of support and a tank, or a little bit of support and a striker, or a bit of a striker and a bit of a tank. All these things can be made. You can be all 3 to a certain extent, and that's just fine. I recently made a jack of all trades character. That one could fit any of these 3 roles and could move between them relatively easily. You fill an entire party with that, that's still going to be an effective party because you're going to have what you need when you need it. But if any of these aspects are completely absent, you will find things harder. There will be certain challenges that are harder. I know I have played in campaigns where turns out everybody is going to make a character that's ranged and stealthy. And I think maybe we can use guerrilla tactics. And you know what? In some combats, that's super effective. But in some campaigns, you end up in situations where that is impossible and you just automatically end up in melee. Maybe you're ambushed or something, and it's just part of the adventure. It's unavoidable. And your characters aren't made for that. And then that's a good way to look at a possible TPK or to have a challenge that wasn't supposed to be life-threatening, be life-threatening. It just doesn't work. Ideally, you just want to have all 3 bases covered at least by somebody. And if you're going to have multiples of anything, maybe multiple tanks. Now there's one out of combat role and one combat role I haven't mentioned yet. And these unfortunately do get filled. The first is the combat role of the person who was one of those role players who thought that D&D isn't about challenges, it's about role-playing. And they often think, for some strange reason, that good role-playing is playing a character that's terrible at contributing. So they'll play something like a wizard with a bad intelligence, or a sorcerer who refuses to learn any effective combat spells, or anything like that. This unfortunately does happen, and often these people are very proud of it, especially when they cause deaths of other characters. That's something to be very proud of, and they fall back on, this is what my character is, and this is what my concept is, and I'm a role player, not a board gamer. Yeah, but you're not really a D&D role player, are you? Because D&D is a mix. Role playing is part of it, challenges are part of it, and there's no reason why those have to be in conflict. Anyone who creates a conflict there is creating a false dilemma. Tempest Stormwind talked about this years and years ago. They called it, if you ever want to look it up, it's called the Stormwind fallacy. This idea that optimization and concept are somehow in conflict. They're not in conflict. You can play interesting, fun characters that are also effective. There's no reason not to do that. The second is an out-of-combat role, and this out-of-combat role I have referred to affectionately as the lump. And I unfortunately have played with lumps who think that D&D is all about the fights. And whenever there's not a fight, they're bored. So they're doing a lot of and whenever we're doing things like maybe we're doing a mystery investigation and we're talking to people, they either make it very clear how bored they are, and of course the characters, they haven't even bothered filling in their skills half the time. We ask, do you have this skill? Oh, I haven't even decided what my skills are yet, because they don't care. They don't want to do this part of the game. And so then they end up in disruptive chit chats with each other that tend to overwhelm the rest of the role playing experience. Or they start to complain, they start to whine, or they start to do disruptive things in game to try to maybe, they'll go to NPCs and pick fights or something just to try to get something going. And these people are just terrible. Please don't be a lump. The lumps are no fun for anybody. Now, anyone who's used to playing video games and used to video game terminology, healers, again, it's just not an effective role. Now, if you want to be healer, just mix it with some support. You can do that very easily with a cleric, or maybe you mix it with a little bit of striking. That, again, very easy to do. And if you want to play a DPS character, do me a favor, don't call it DPS. DPS is obviously a video game centric term. I've heard DPR used, as in damage per round, and that's okay. If you want to call your striker character a DPR character, that's fine. Though usually D&D offers more options than just dealing damage, but if that's how you want to refer to it, at least use that rather than DPS. And that's all I really have to say about party roles. That's actually quite a bit. I'm pretty long-winded about things like this. You know how I get when I'm passionate about things. Anyway, that's all I have to say about roles. I hope you'll enjoy me next time. I'm going to be talking about druids very soon. Until then, I'm going to sit back and relax, and I'm going to have some fun, because D&D's for everyone. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next time.